accidentally played our win jingle there. It was not a Sensing tonight. But welcome back to Game Over Ottawa, everybody. Maude here, back once again. Unfortunate 3-2 loss to the Kings for the Sens here tonight. And I'm lucky enough to be joined by two guests. We have Shane Malloy from Hockey Prospect Radio. How are you doing tonight, Shane?
Doing great. Looking forward to the great discussion.
And recurring guest Louis from the Zubcast. How are you?
Very, very good. Happy to be back. Just unfortunate and coincides with another Sens loss.
Yeah, it is pretty rough for that so far. I feel like I've mostly covered losses at this point so far this season, even though it's only been 9 games. It's just it's getting a little bit out of hand pretty quickly here tonight. So I wouldn't say that it was one of the Sens' worst games so far this season, but obviously not enough to get things done here tonight. I guess I'll throw it to you first, Louis. What did you notice overall as how the Sens played as a team really today that led to them not being able to get it done?
I mean, I felt like it was pretty staggered between like a different story between the three periods. Like at the first, yes, there was like the penalty that led to the goal for LA. And just in general, there's like a whole 5 minute chunk where LA was really dominating, but the rest was pretty solid. And then the second, obviously, with all the injuries and the injury news of Greg not being able to come back, made it really tough. And there were even boos like in the arena late
Mm-hmm.
before the Kubalik goal. And then you could tell they were a little bit more fired up. But ultimately, it was just so messy for the last, like, even though they made it close and really got some momentum going, it was really messy and sloppy play for the second half of the third. And obviously, the Hamonic penalty kind of killed any momentum because it didn't just stop there at the penalty. After that, it took them a whole minute and a half before they could get possession, get together, and eventually just led to a dump in where they were just trying to get any sort of sustained pressure, which didn't really happen in time, unfortunately.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I have to say that comeback attempt, especially in the last 5 minutes or so, there was really hard to watch. It was just
Oh,
kind of the 5-on-5 play in this game was just really tough for the Sens to generate anything. I guess Shane, was there anything about how the Kings played that you think led to Ottawa struggling to generate chances?
Well, certainly their puck possession was a significant factor, as well as when you notice the Kings play, one of the things that really sort of stands out to me is, every one of their players, it's really important to them to ensure that there's puck support with or without the puck. And so from them, if there's a battle, somebody else is going to be engaged right away. Or if they have to make a quick, short pass, that player is in the right spot. And I think that consistently made a difference. And the Kings took advantage of any mistake that the Ottawa Senators had. And that's where a lot of their goals were generated by and some of it was unlucky, but you also have to be in the right place to be lucky. We sometimes talk about luck as being an independent variable, but I think it's dependent because if you're always you're in the right place more often, or the place where goals are scored, or in the place where goals are defended, you're more likely for good things to occur. And I think the Kings were in those places more often. And then when something went wrong for the Sens, they pounced. And that was really the tail of the tape, I think, for most of the game. And then, of course, we've seen it. This isn't the first time the Sens have done this, that late charge of trying to desperation to get back into the game. And it seemed a little bit, just too late once again. And I think that really says something about the depth of the team. There isn't enough overall depth in this team when especially if they have injuries, there's not enough guys down below to really contribute to a level that they can compete against playoff caliber teams.
Especially with the injuries, missing two forwards tonight. Like, I remember, I think it was with just under 2 minutes left, we were finally getting the puck out of our zone, and I think Stützle just had to shoot it in because they were tired and needed a line change. And when you're missing forwards like that, uh, there's not much you can do about that, so that's a huge hindrance as well. And I agree with what you're saying about the Kings in terms of being in the right spots. It kind of looks lucky sometimes, but they know where to be in those right spots, right place and right time. I think they're just a super relentless and structured team that just comes at you in waves, and we just saw it consistently all night. I think it was a really good 60-minute effort from the Kings, and that's something that the Sens really haven't been able to pull off consistently this season, is those 60-minute efforts, finding themselves in another multi-goal hole early in this game. That's been a theme so far this season too. I'll throw it to Louis. What do you think about the Sens constantly being down like 2-0, 3-0, even worse sometimes in these games? Is it a matter of like team systems, or is it just the players not being ready to play?
I think it is like a little bit of system stuff. Like as Shane said, it's a lot of what we saw last year, right? Where you're lacking depth down the lineup, and because of that, you only really get a chance when you have your top guys out. And the problem is, you get in this routine where one bottom line, like one of the bottom six lines, ends up getting hemmed in. They get really tired, so they have to dump the puck out. So a new line comes in, and then that same cycle repeats where because they're coming in, the Kings have the puck in this example. They come down, sustained pressure against us, and then we're tired by the time we get the puck, have to dump it out, and that's a shift wasted for a top six team. So that's definitely going up against us. And yeah, a big problem is the depth, and that's seemingly not going to get any better. Like I'm pretty sure DJ said, from what I saw, that Kastelik and Greg are going to miss games, right?
Oh
Because of the
God.
severity of the injury, which is terrible. That sucks. Like, especially for Ridley, who's having such a good season, right? Like he was leading, tied with Pavel Mintyukov, by the way. Shout out to my former Ottawa 67's all-star defenseman there. But he's been doing so well, and it really is a heartbreaker to see him go down like that.
No,
For
one of the
sure.
things, to sort of like jump onto that as well is the team's quite young, even with having Mark and Ridley back in the lineup. Even if you end up having Zub and Brandstrom, it's a young team. So anytime you have players that are under the age of 24, particularly, they're going to be consistently inconsistent. Because in many cases, we all remember when we're like 20 years old how inconsistent we were, and that's based on brain development. And it's just a fact of nature that you can be as talented as you want and skilled as you want, but until your brain finishes developing, you're going to be consistently inconsistent when it comes to decision making, particularly under duress. And human beings, we talk about it on TV, but it's not true. We don't rise to the challenge. No human being does that. We only follow to the level of our training. And until those habits are consistent, you're going to have inconsistencies in those young players, and these things are going to happen. And when it comes to systems, I mean, I'm not the biggest fan personally of DJ's system. I don't necessarily like the way his team always plays. There's almost times where I'm like, there's unnecessary dumping of the puck into the offensive zone to go and chase and get it.
Yep.
Like
Absolutely.
Don't get me wrong. Not everything is about puck possession. There are times when dumping the puck in is actually the right play, but it's you have to do it. Like that's part of our system. Just go do it, even if that's not the right play. And then you want your F1s and F2s to come barreling into the defensemen and start hucking their bodies, which is, obviously necessary in the playoffs, but you do run the risk of injuries. Like when you have a guy like Ridley Gregg, who's like a dynamo, he doesn't care. He's going to throw his body around. But when you have a body of he's not very big, injuries are going to happen. So I'm not saying that you can't coach that out of somebody. If they're players like that, they're going to be a dog on the bone. But I think there's more intelligent ways in terms of having different systems that are more attuned to the talent you have on the team, but also what the players like to play. And I don't get the impression that the players really love the system they're playing in.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought up the dump and chase because that's exactly where I was going to go next. I saw a stat earlier this week that the Sens ranked fourth last in the league in terms of 5v5 carried zone entries. So it's at the point where it's just they're not even doing it. It's like dumping it like 70% of the time. And like
For the sake of dumping it.
Yeah, there were so many times we would shoot it in. I think we did this with the goalie pulled too. We shoot it in and there's only one guy forechecking. The other guys aren't even really getting in there. It's half the time it feels like just dump and no chase too.
Yeah, and I think, when I've been observing hockey, you look at certain styles and it fits certain players. And I'm always of the adage is that the teacher, which would be the coach, has to adjust to the students that he has. the players instead of the other way around. You really have to look at your roster and go, okay, what is the best system that we can play based on the roster construction that we have? And then what's coming in the system and what is the, organizational mandate of the style of players we have. And then, augment your system based on that instead of saying, this is the way I like to see the game played and this is the way we're going to play. And it's not always necessarily effective for the personnel that you have. And there just doesn't seem any kind of leeway in that. It's just, this is the way we play and this is the way I like to play. And we're going to figure out I'm just going to keep bashing it into my players until they get it. And if they don't get it, they just, they play less minutes. So I don't know. It seems to be a bit of a vicious circle in that respect.
I think it's very rare as well to see a coach, especially one that has been with the same team for so long, to just suddenly switch up his strategies too. So if the management group agrees with us that his style isn't really fitting the type of players that we have on this roster, and now the fact that we are sitting below 500 after 9 games, I'm pretty sure DJ is going to be on the hot seat at this point, right? Like, I'll throw it to you, Louis. Do you think you would fire him like as soon as now if you were management, or would you give him a little more time?
Well, based on the comments that Andlauer and Steos gave yesterday, right, it doesn't necessarily seem like it, and they seem relatively supportive. Again, this could just be what they're saying to the media, especially given all the other stuff that's been flying around, because God, have they had to deal with a lot over the last 10 days, right? And you could also throw in the factor that it was a 300th game tonight. They maybe didn't want to put any sort of cloud over that. But yeah, listen, it hasn't been working. It's been consistently poor early on in the season. Personally, I do think there are definitely better options out there. And there is something to say about likability amongst the players, but when the on-ice product is where it's at right now, and like, I agree, there are some good forecheckers on this team, absolutely. But the problem is you also have so much talent and skill that would be much better suited for a more dynamically and assertive system, which is not being taken advantage of here at all.
No, I know, I agree with that in the fact that, okay, there's different styles of forechecking. Now, there's the forechecking where you're barreling into the defenseman every time and trying to put him, through the end boards. And then there's pressure as well. It doesn't mean you can't make contact, because that's great too, but there are different ways to forecheck to force turnovers. And
Absolutely.
I'm always of the adage is that if you're going to beat my team, you're going to beat us with a great play. If you beat us with a great play, so be it. You shrug your shoulders, they beat us with a great play, but force them to make a great play. And the game moves faster through the puck than skating, but you have some skaters that can force guys into areas where it's not an ideal option for them and force them to make mistakes. And like, there's teams out there that I like watching play. I like how Carolina plays. Like,
Oh, yeah.
I think
octane.
I think the way Carolina plays actually fits a lot of the personnel that Ottawa has. Or even if you watch college hockey, if you look at Quinnipiac University, similar. They're a relentless puck pursuit team. If you have the puck, we're skating to get it back. It's not passive at all. And they're not necessarily smashing bodies all the time, but there's always a body on you. And at some point, you got to move that puck. And it has to be fast. Otherwise, they're on you. So, just because I look at Ottawa's lineup and there's just some really, really strong skaters, and they understand how to skate the game. It's not necessarily skating fast, because that's not always productive. I've seen a lot of guys who skate super fast and they skate themselves into a dead end. You have to understand how they skate the game. And I think that from that standpoint, I think there's enough players on this roster to make that type of system effective. So I'm curious to see what, this management group, the ownership group is going to do, because there is a lot of flux, and it is now their opportunity. If they're going to make changes, and I'm not advocating for, DJ to lose his job, but if they're going to make changes, there is going to be a time where they start to bring in a general manager and he wants to bring in more personnel. And then, okay, maybe, they have the discussion that it's time to move on from this coaching group and bring in different personnel and try something different in terms of the style of play that they want. That doesn't mean you can't play hard. I mean, Carolina Hurricanes play hard. Right? There are other teams that play systems that are, I wouldn't consider bang and crash like, the old Calgary Flames, but you can still play hard hockey and still play that way. So I'm curious to see what happens. I think the Ottawa Senators at this point are the most intriguing team in the NHL, not because what's happening on the ice, but what potentially can happen off the ice.
Yeah, it's always just constant entertainment with the Sens, whether good or bad. A lot of drama, and obviously we're gonna get into that a little bit later with all the Pierre Dorion stuff that happened this week. But just a little bit more on tonight's game yet. I think I'm going to try to find some positives here for the Sens. Is that, like, I'll give you guys my answer first, and then I'll ask both of you. Gonna ask both of you to name who stood out the most positively for the Sens for you tonight. For me, it was Korpisalo. I think he has had a really good stretch of games here. None of the 3 goals were his fault here today, and it was a lot of shots on goal in the end by the Kings too. So I would have him as my MVP for the Sens tonight, even though it does end up being a losing effort. Just to get a little bit of positivity in here. Who do you think stood out for you for the Sens today, Louis?
I was also gonna go Korpisalo because he
Makes
saved
sense.
let me see, 0.9 goal saved above expected tonight, which is solid. He absolutely gave this team a chance. He was single-handedly preventing Kempe from scoring a hat trick
Oh
tonight.
yeah, he could have had so many.
Yeah.
My God,
Yeah.
he was buzzing tonight. And I don't know what it is, but Kempe always does super well here in Ottawa. Because earlier I was talking with my dad watching the game, and he still hasn't forgiven Kempe for his insane performance 4 or 5 years ago when we went to go see a game where Kempe just lit us up. And yeah, Korpisalo did super well. I don't know if in his 2 months there in LA he maybe got the book on Adrian or not, but he did very, very well tonight. And yeah, it's hard to find a lot of positives because it very much was a doom and gloom game. Yes, there were some bright spots here and there, but overall, Korpisalo was absolutely the brightest light for sure.
What do you
Now,
think, Shane?
I'm not going to go down the Korpisalo train because that's where I was going to go. But
Of
another
course.
player that sort of jumps out was Tkachuk, only because if you look at when the chips were down, he was a guy that emotionally was talking to players on the bench, and that's necessary for a captain to do so. And it's one of the things, although Ottawa Senators have had this trend of getting behind early in games, I give them credit. They don't give up. There may be a late charge, and there's been a lot of late charges in games lately, but I give them credit as a collective group. They don't just give up and roll over. There's fight in the group. And so emotionally and mentally, they're obviously, there's will there. And that's what I liked about Tkachuk. It's just a reminder, hey guys, we can come back. We've done this kind of thing before, or we've done some late hard charging. Let's try it again. So for me, that matters because he's the engine. He's just not going to let the guys get flat and be like, oh, woe is me. It's one of these games again. So I just watch body language when I watch games. I particularly enjoy watching it when I'm watching live games because that really dictates what's going to happen in the future. Is bad body language. That's just a huge red flag for me. And that didn't happen on their bench tonight.
That's a very great point. That's obviously what you want to see from your captain. I do think that even though this is a pretty young team, the leadership group is quite solid. We saw Claude Giroux doing sort of a similar thing last week against the Islanders when we were down, especially after Brandstrom got injured, sorry, and the troops kind of needed to be rallied there. He was really pumping everyone up on the bench and being encouraging. So between Giroux and Tkachuk and a couple of other guys, I do think they have the right leadership in the locker room so that this won't, sort of just snowball and go way out of control. But I do think we are in danger of the season getting a little bit out of hand, even though I'm glad you brought up the leadership there because we do have guys who can help mitigate that a little bit, even though the play on the ice is getting a little rough lately. And before we move on to our next segment, talking about Pierre Dorion, because obviously we have to, just going to remind everyone in the chat that if you have any questions for us, for either me, Shane, or Louis, leave those at any time no matter what topic it's about, and we'll be looking to answer some of those towards the end of the show. So whatever it's about, if you've got any questions, let us know. And then from there, to introduce the Dorion segment, I think I want to start off with talking about the actual punishment from the NHL. And I have talked about this a lot already, so I'm going to defer to you guys a little bit. Were you surprised at how harsh that punishment was? And also, do you think it makes sense that this was the straw that broke the camel's back for Dorion to be finished with the Senators at this point? I'll start with you, Shane.
No, I'm not surprised by the level of punishment. Reason is that it affected two other NHL teams. If it had only affected your team, the Ottawa Senators, then that would be different. Like if it was a circumvention of the salary cap and it was only going to affect your team and it happened to be a signing, but because it affected two other teams in subsequent trades, then and it's an embarrassment not only for the Ottawa Senators, but then for the Vegas Golden Knights, and then an annoyance more than anything for the Anaheim Ducks, but then an embarrassment for the league. Because your management, you can't make those kind of mistakes. Like you need to have checks and balances in your systems and have people in place in your office that make sure these things don't happen. And now I'm unsure. We've asked these questions why the NHL doesn't have a central registry that has all of these in place, right? Like so that everybody can refer to that, so that not only it's sent in by the agents but the teams. So when contracts are signed and there's a registry, so that anybody can access that. Now you don't there are situations obviously when a player will have a limited no trade. And he hasn't assigned what teams that is, and that can be private, and he can disclose that at any time, like when he wants to. But at least it says he has a limited no trade, and it's 10 teams he can't be traded to. So at least they understand that. But I do understand, and I know it's unfair. I know some Sens fans are going to say this is unfair, but I understand why the NHL came so hard on them, because it affected other teams. So I get that. Do I think it's a fireable offense? And was that the final straw? Yes. Like I'm never an advocate of people losing their job, but it was such a catastrophic mistake. And the punishment is like, if it remains a first round pick, that is a massive loss of asset. That's worth millions of dollars, millions. We're talking maybe depending on the skill of the player that you could have drafted, could be anywhere from $10 to $20 million that you just lost your franchise. So for me, because I look at NHL teams as Fortune 500 companies, and the general manager is a CEO. So you're the CEO of a Fortune 500 company. And if you made a catastrophic mistake where that just lost your company that amount of money, that's a fireable offense. And, people have to be accountable for those actions.
That's an interesting way to put it with the monetary value of a first round draft pick, because I was kind of thinking I think it would have been more fair if the NHL just fined the Sens money instead of a draft pick itself. But then it turns out, obviously, depending on the quality of player, as you said, that the draft pick can have huge monetary value in the future too. So, and Louis, would you pretty much agree with all of that, or do you have any different outlook in terms of the punishment?
Yeah, I do think it is ridiculous that there is no sort of database or registry that's accessible by the teams. Yes, some of the info that would be related to the contracts is more on the private side, but then could easily be made accessible to whatever team acquires them or whatever. It really is kind of ridiculous that doesn't exist already. As for the punishment and resulting in Dorion's firing, it did kind of feel like Dorion was potentially on the outs, right? So I'm not really surprised that this ended up resulting in him losing his job. And it's not like a scenario where you can look at it and say, okay, ignoring the punishment, he made the mistake. Should he be fired? We're not in that kind of situation. The team lost a first round pick, right? And now I'm kind of looking at it, given what Andlauer said yesterday and what we have seen in the past, for example, with New Jersey when they got penalized with the Kovalchuk situation. when new ownership had come in, they had said, hey, all the people who were in charge back then, the GM, whatever, the ownership was different. So should the punishment maybe be rescinded or lessened? And it did. It got changed to the 30th overall pick instead of them just completely losing the pick. And given everything that was said about how the NHL was essentially potentially negligent in disclosing this sort of information to the buyer to ensure a higher price for the seller during the sale, that is also potentially a case that Andlauer and the rest of the organization could raise up to have that penalty lessened. So I am interested in seeing that and seeing what comes of it. But yeah, it's definitely a big blow, and I'm not necessarily surprised to see it result in this.
Yeah, that's kind of how I'm coping as a fan, is that whole New Jersey situation where they ended up rescinding the penalty a little bit, or at least making it not as harsh after a few years had passed. And because it was a similar situation where the Devils had changed ownership around that time, so they weren't the ones in charge when it happened. Maybe there's a little bit of an agreement here where Bettman says, like, okay, you weren't here when this happened. If you get rid of Pierre because he was the guy responsible, then maybe we'll go a little lighter in the future. Don't know if that's the case, but that's kind of how I'm thinking as a fan, in terms of, I feel like the punishment is just a little bit too harsh, so I'm hoping that it can get lowered in the future. But yeah, Dorion, his tenure with the Sens finally comes to an end after, I think, 7 years. I think it was 2016 when he started as GM. I mean, his actual tenure with the Sens is even longer than that, but as GM, 7 whole years. And the team's record was not very good over the course of that time span. Only 3 teams, I think it was Detroit, Arizona, and some other bottom feeder, had worse records over that time span. And obviously, when Dorion inherited the team, we had that amazing season going to the conference finals, so we weren't expecting it to be this bad 7 years ago, for sure. I guess just for me, I recognize the ups and downs of Dorion's career. Like, there's many good moves that he made that are still able to be seen on the roster today in terms of how this team is set up for the future. But then there's been a lot of blunders. So for me personally, I'm kind of ready for a new person leading the Sens. Even though I wasn't really like screaming for Dorion to be fired, I think it's probably just about time we get like a new set of eyes in there calling the shots. What about you, Louis?
Yeah, it very much has been a roller coaster, like with him at the helm. He's definitely been one of the most active, noticeable, and entertaining, for better or for worse, GM in the league since 2016 when he came in. And yes, he gave us again, it can be debated how much credit you can give him for that 2017 run, right? Because he came in April of 2016 where most of that core was already there, and then he made the Zibanejad and a second for Brassard deal, right? That ended up, and Brassard was great in that playoff run. But after that, we don't talk about the difference in player value there. But yeah, and there will totally be like good value inherited from what he had done, right? Like the Stützle, the Sanderson, Kachuk contracts, and the Chychrun trade and all that. Those will be players that will be here for a good bit, and those are excellent additions. But yeah, as you said, there were a lot of blunders. Like, again, I'm still surprised we have Travis Hamonic. I'm not gonna lie. I did not expect us to trade a third for him not too long ago and then re-sign him. And there's been a lot of stuff, like the DeBrincat trade at first was great, ended up not working out, and then the not so ceremonious exit either. I do wonder if he gets another look at some point for another NHL team, or if he has to kind of build his credibility back up, or if what he has done and the blunder that essentially cost the team a first round pick essentially takes him off the radar, because that's something I'm definitely going to be keeping track of.
That's a good thing to bring up. What do you think about that, Shane? Do you think this blunder is the type of thing where he might be out of the NHL for a little while, or do you think he gets picked up again soon?
Well, let's look at it from 2 different perspectives. If you look at the Ottawa Senators draft and development record from the salary cap era, beginning salary cap era, 2006 to 2015, that first 10 years where the valuation of players radically changed. The Ottawa Senators were, I believe, second or third in most efficient teams of drafting players and developing them into playing 200 plus games or more in the NHL. They're in the top 3. So they did an excellent job in that respect. But then if you look at what happens, the difference between a consistent playoff team and a contender is being consistent in their drafting and developing. So if you look at the LA Kings, the Washington Capitals, the Anaheim Ducks, they're all in the top 5. Now, Anaheim is a different case study because I think their general manager at the time, Bob Murray's, he had similar issues to Pierre in terms of his asset management was poor. And that cost them all the assets that Martin Madden and other people had, accumulated for him. But then what happens if you look at, yes, the Ottawa Senators were excellent in drafting and developing from 06 to 15, but you look from 2016 to 2021, I know everybody gives them credit, like there's this good young core, but 2016, Logan Brown was drafted 11th overall. He's played 99 games in the NHL. Shane Bowers was 28th overall. In 2017, he's played 1 game. Jacob Bernard Docker played his 37th game. That's 2018, 26th overall pick. Lassie Thompson in 2019, 18 games so far. Now, Logan Brown is 25, Bowers is 24, Docker is 23, Lassie Thompson is 23. If you're going to be a contender, every one of those players has to be in the Sens lineup and playing. You can't be below 80% efficiency in the first round when you're drafting, developing. Now, we can't really judge Tyler Boucher yet at 10th overall. Like, as much as I like Tyler Boucher as a player, I certainly wouldn't have drafted him 10th overall, even though I fully admit I have biases towards power forwards. They come back to haunt me on my list every time until recent years where I got smacked around enough, I learned my lesson. But if you look at not only those 4 first-round picks, but some second-round picks in there too that didn't work out. Jonathan Dorion is another one where, traded away in an asset that was burned. You just can't, within the first 45 picks, you have to hit players. You have no choice. You have to hit them. And that's the difference between this team being the New Jersey Devils right now and them being where they are, is those first round picks not turning out. Now, there is an evaluation aspect value of that. There's a player development issue in that, but also one of the themes that has come up a lot in my conversations, because I go out and scout players too. I scouted for the USHL, but in the conversations I have on my radio show on Hockey Prospect Radio, where we have NHL guests, is off air. There's a lot of discussion about GMs meddling in drafts. And because they don't get to see the players all the time, especially if they were a former scout, they like to get their fingerprints on the draft. And when GMs tend to influence drafts, it tends not to work out very well in their favor. And I wrote an academic paper based on a general manager in the past. And he was fully transparent of him interfering in the draft. And he goes, at the second time I learned my lesson. And that was D. Lombardi from LA. And he goes, no, I just let my guys do their thing. And all I do is I come in, I'm a facilitator, and I ask questions and I punch holes in their argument of a player. Okay, what are you guys missing in this profile? Just to ensure that you guys have all the data you need. And sometimes this is what happens when a GM gets influenced. He doesn't see the players enough time to build out that profile. And then they meddle and they pick the players they want, and it blows up in their face. And it happens. And Dorion isn't like in an island by himself. That happens. It's happened more frequently in the history of the NHL, particularly in the last 20 years, more than some fans may realize. And that is part of the legacy, is those four first round picks not turning out to what they need to be. Now, could Docker find his way? There's a possibility that he gets over the 200 game mark, but we'll see. And now I haven't even got into the trades or the free agent signings of Dorion, where I think there's just been, and I really like Pierre personally, so it's not personal. I have to look at this situation objectively, from an economic standpoint. And how I view it is that there was too many inefficiencies in the valuation of players, whether it's recouping assets coming back or the contract that contracts that he's putting out in terms of it seemed like he was always in a catch-up mode. Now, not to speak ill of the dead, but obviously the previous owner in Eugene Melnyk, you know, you look at the budget that Pierre had, and that was an influence as well. I mean, we talk about it, like how small that staff is and his unwillingness to hire more staff. So not only, Pierre was handcuffed, he didn't have enough personnel around him comparative to other teams. So, you can only juggle so many balls in the air at the same time until you start dropping them. And in that case, that's going to happen. And I think it was a culmination of those things that ended up, the Sens are where they are because of that.
Yeah,
And I would like to add,
go ahead.
sorry, about like what you had mentioned with the whole stats for the Sens draft wise from 2006 to 2016 and then 2016 onwards. And that perfectly coincides with Pierre being with the org, but not as general manager, right? Because he joined
running the draft, because he was running the draft. Like he's actually, you have to give him credit. He's actually a very good evaluator of players. Like, and he has a track record to prove that out from 06 to 15. It proves it out when he was running the draft. There did exceptionally well. But when you leave that role and you always have been a scout, it's hard to kick that habit. And I've talked to GMs who have done that. Like, they've jumped up levels and now it's so hard for them to not want to, like, that's their instinct. They're by nature, they're scouts. And then it's a really harsh contrast of 06 to 15, then 16 to really to 20, because I'm not going to count, Tyler Boucher in that as well. And they've had some successes, but look, when you're picking that high, you better have successes, but you can't have 11th overall that doesn't pan out, right? You can't have a 19th overall that hasn't panned out. Even in the later rounds, when obviously the probability of these players playing 200 games, drops after 22, still at 28 and 26, Bowers and Docker, you got to find a way for these guys to play. Like, even if you're going to trade them away, you got to build up asset. And it just didn't happen. And that says something about the lack of personnel they have too, as much as, their player development staff, and Sean Donovan and Brad Winchester, they're doing as much as they possibly can, but two full-time people in player development over that time frame, that's not good enough. Like, you look at teams that are successful in that area, they got 4 or 5 guys. LA Kings have 5. 4 and 5 guys working in player development. Sens have 2, right? Like, this is part of the, the situation that Pierre had to deal with as well. And whether if it was his own volition or ownership said, this is the amount of budget we're willing to do, and you just have to work through it. Fortune 500 companies can't be run this way. Like, you have to treat, like, I laugh when people say, "Oh, is it the business side or the hockey side?" Well, the hockey side is the business side. It's operations.
It's all together, yeah.
It's operations. It's no different than an operations department of a Fortune 500 company. It should be treated as such. So your general manager, CEO, you have to give them enough resources to hire enough people. The game is too complex, and there's too many moving parts to have one assistant general manager. That's insane. You should have 3. You need to have 3, and then staff underneath that. And look, I like a lot of their scouts. I think they've done a really good job on the amateur and pro side in terms of, like, you got scouts like Bob Janasek and George Farger and Don Boyd. On the amateur side, they're really strong scouts. Jim Clark on the pro side is the director. He does a really good job there too. But when you don't have enough people in middle management, the decisions are left to like 1 or 2 people. And then it starts, like, you can't function that way because you get caught in a silo, and you need some dissenting voices in the group to be able to make it more holistic when it comes to decision making. So I think that what's happened to the Senators, if you pull back and look at it as a macro investigation, it's an interesting case study of why you need to invest in your staff. Like, I'd make an argument that the top 7 decision makers in an NHL hockey ops department are more valuable than the players. to the success of the franchise over a decade. Because
Absolutely.
player rosters are going to overturn, but if you don't make smart decisions consistently within your group of the top 7 decision makers, or to 10, depending on the size of your group, that's where the impact is. Like, of course, the players have to play, but if you look at successful franchise, let's look at LA as an example. Look at their turnover of players, but their staff hasn't turned over a lot. A few people have left and retired, and a couple of people have moved on to other organizations, but the core is still there, and they keep finding players. So why should Ottawa be any different?
Yeah, in terms of Dorion, not having the help and having too much on his plate as well, I do wonder if that could be kind of one of the biggest factors that resulted in the mistake with the whole Dadanov debacle. Like, if you have more guys in the room in management to help him out, and other guys like involved in the trade call and stuff in the room during that type of thing, they can say like, hey, oh, you missed this detail, or oh, that's not accurate. Like, the guy was kind of hung out to dry by ownership. So we do have to consider all of that with Dorion's tenure, is that he was really understaffed, and it was kind of just a one-man show for a lot of it. But I feel like despite that, it's still a bit of a rocky track record overall. It's tough. Louis, in terms of like player management overall, or I guess asset management, I mean, like, how would you rate Dorion in terms of like his trade record? Because to me, I feel like it's kind of like the bad outweighs the good for a lot of it. Like, trading away Zibanejad, Duchesne acquiring him the first time obviously went poorly, and then you look at when we traded him away, we don't have any assets left from that. We got a first and a couple of prospects. Just Lassie Thompson, I guess. So he's the one that's left, but he was gone on waivers briefly, and now he's back. So not a ton of value left in that asset. And there was the Hoffman trade debacle. Stone, some people think we didn't get enough for. And you mentioned the DeBrincat trade earlier as also something that might have been a little mismanaged. I feel like, obviously, we've talked a lot about the drafting side, which has gone poorly in the last few years outside of those top few picks. But in terms of trades, like, do you agree with me that it's been pretty rough, Louis?
Yeah, it felt like he was playing a lot of catch up and trying to fix mistakes that he had done previously, right? Like the Matt Murray and Nikita Zaitsev, that entire trajectory is a perfect example of that. It embodies exactly what kept happening, is that Matt Murray trade was potentially what was the exact amount he gave up? I think it was a second and
John Gruden, I think.
John Gruden. Yes. I was like, it's the guy who's, who also has the same name as a former NFL coach or current. I don't remember. I don't follow the NFL enough. But yeah, and it's just a lot of that was, okay, we've made this mistake. How do we recover from it? When right from the get-go, we'd be like, maybe we hold off and reevaluate this before making it, right? And it ended up costing us in picks. I don't know what the exact combined total was, but just from Zaitsev and Murray alone, you lose like 2 seconds, a third, and some like B or C level prospects for guys who didn't pan out and probably weren't gonna just from the start, seemingly. So it is a little tough. Yes, there were some diamonds in the rough there. But like, and I think he would be looked upon in a very different light if the Carlson trade didn't pan out as exceptionally as it did. Because I remember the day that happened, I was in chemistry class. I fell to my knees.
I was so mad.
Like, that was terrible. And then just sure enough, the floor just fell up from underneath the Sharks. They completely collapsed. Josh Norris, I mean, obviously with the whole injuries, it's been tough for him, and it's nice to finally see him come back to playing. Like, if it's at whatever level, it's just nice to see him fully healthy again and to know what he's capable of from the past. And obviously Tim Stützle being the crowning jewel of that. But for a long time, all we thought that we were going to get was Norris, who was a middle 60 prospect, and a late first round pick, right? Along with obviously the DeMello, Tierney, Balsers, which none are still here, obviously. But I think that gives him a lot more credit than we had thought it would have, like from firsthand. And the thing is, I don't think this was a very probable thing to happen at all. I think we are in one of the few timelines where this ended up panning out so well for us. And I'm super happy it did. But then again, at the time, it probably was not the best deal, and it shines on him better than I think it probably should.
Yeah, it's
Louis,
like
that's a
his
good
best
point,
win.
Louis.
I was gonna say his best win is a little bit of luck, right?
It's a lot of luck. It's a
Yeah.
lot.
I'm glad you brought up that point of probability. The probability of it turning out that way, of getting that pick so high, wasn't like it might be single digit probability of that happening. But hey,
It's
sometimes
small,
sometimes that does happen. And that's where, in terms of asset management, I found in some cases, and Louis, you pointed this out, it's you're chasing bad money. Like there's a sunk cost, and now you're throwing money at a sunk cost. You're better off just cutting it loose. And, just basic economic. I'm not even talking about behavioral economic. I mean, that is behavioral economics in a nutshell. Is you can be risk averse, and then you despise like risk so badly, but then you want to make up for it because they work in an industry where everything is front facing. Like how many industries, would people falter every time? Like every time you make a decision, you have people yelling at you, and you have people on the radio, and people writing about you, and people blogging about you, and people on shows like this. Every time you make a decision, they're on you for it. That's a tremendous, like if you don't understand how to handle that, that is problematic, because in reality, you shouldn't care what other people, what any of us say. It should be relatively irrelevant to you as a general manager, because you have to base your decisions off the information that you have, not what this consensus is yelling, because most of us are making, judgments based on a lack of information until it's way over, and then things start to bleed out, as it has in this circumstance. So it's an interesting place for him to be in. But if I looked at it in a totality, I think, the legacy of that 2016 to 19 draft, those 4 drafts really hurt in terms of asset. And then some of the, most of the trades did not turn out in his favor. And thankfully that the Karlsson one has, because I don't think people would be praising this team for having this big, young, nice core. That wouldn't exist.
No, you're taking away their number 1C and number 1D in that case. Like that's a completely different franchise and identity.
100%. So basically you're pretty much, you're be the Buffalo Sabres, but 3 years ago. That's where they'd be, in all honesty.
Yeah, that's scary.
Right?
That's scary to think about.
Well, and it's also, there's the, and I'm not throwing rocks, but it's such a difficult situation, is that's where, rational decisions and patience matter. And we'll point to the Buffalo Sabres. Kevin Adams came in, you started seeing consistent, rational decisions and patience. It's amazing what happens in an organization if you stick to that and don't chase bad money, and just don't. If you make a bad decision, just cut it loose and don't try to backfill it, because it just generally, if you're chasing, you just make things worse. Like you're throwing gasoline on a fire in that respect. Just cut your losses. It's a sunk cost. Let it go.
Yeah, so that's definitely a key attribute that we're going to want the next Sens GM to have in their arsenal. And in terms of who might be the next Sens GM, there's been a few names floating around out there from Elliot Friedman. I believe he reported potentially Matthew Darche, Peter Chiarelli, and Jason Spezza. And then there's also some names we're going to get into here that Shane has let me know about guys who have, I think, been interviewing for GM positions around the league before, right? That are some new names that haven't been mentioned yet.
Yeah, well, let's talk about Peter Chiarelli in that respect. Obviously, Matthew Darche, because the Tampa Bay Lightning have won, once two Stanley Cups. He's been in the organization for 4 years. He was, he's director of hockey operations, and this year, he's assistant general manager. So he does have although well respected, and I've talked to him on quite a few occasions. So I think I have a pretty decent bead. Like, he's a very intelligent guy, but very small sample size in terms of experience. 4 years is not a lot of time. So there's that. But obviously highly competent, very well thought of, intelligent. My curiosity with Peter Chiarelli is this a group that he would want to be a part of as a GM? Like, is he comfortable being in a position where he has a president of hockey operations overseeing what he's doing? Is he okay with that dynamic? That I don't know, because
Do
I
you
haven't
think he
had a
might
chance.
want a role that's like higher up in the organization, sort of?
Well,
If
I mean,
he's going to come back to a team?
there isn't, right? There's
Well, yeah,
president of
like
hockey
on any potential team.
on any potential team. No, I think if he was strictly just the general manager and he was like the top person in charge, I don't, without having that conversation with him, I don't know what his comfort level would be in that dynamic on this
Mhm.
team, right? Because there's going to be a lot of heavy lifting for the general manager. So that I don't know. Would he have an interest in the Ottawa Senators? Of course, he used to work there. Of course, he still lives in the city. And of course, there's only 32 general manager positions. So it's hard not to put your hat into the ring when you're looking for a new opportunity. So that's part of it as well. So that's in there as well. But then if you start to look around the league and assistant general managers who have in the past have gone in and interviewed for GM positions around the league. And I always like to look back, like, so I've been fortunate with my show at Hockey Prospect Radio. We're in our 19th season. I've interviewed the majority of the potential GM candidates and potential assistant GM candidates over the last 18 years. And pretty much I've interviewed those people at least a dozen times, 10 times each. So I have all this qualitative, evidence to support that. And I go back and I listen to these interviews that I've done, and many of them are on video. So I watch the video again and take notes. So, because it doesn't matter how often somebody speaks, they always leave breadcrumbs of how they make decisions, what they emphasize, what's important to them. If you listen to them closely, what words they emphasize, their voice fluctuations. So I've been compiling these lists, and then I go back and do a bunch of quantitative data, as we talked about with Ottawa Senators draft and developing. So the names that kind of keep coming up is I try to look at it from this perspective. What is their hockey experience? Have they worked in a bunch of different departments throughout a hockey ops department? What is the success rates from the player development and the drafting side, the pro side as well? That's really important. Like, when they've been in that organization, do they have practical business experience outside of hockey? I think that's, important thing to look at. Do they have academic education? Because it's something else to lean on. I think that is really important. And then, have you won? Have you built up an organization and won? Because I think that's valuable too, to go through that cycle, right? To win and then go back and rebuild again. So the four names that I came up with based on all the data I've collected is the four. I'll just rattle them off and we can talk about each of them individually, but it's Martin Madden, the assistant general manager for Anaheim, Ross Mahoney, the assistant general manager in Washington, Mike Futa, who used to be the assistant GM in LA, and they won a couple cups, and then Mark Yannetti, who's the director of scouting in Los Angeles. Those four guys are four names that I bring up because if you look at all the attributes and the skill sets that I talked about, they check almost all those boxes off. Like, every one of them almost checks off every box. So even if you look at Martin Madden, the Anaheim Ducks from 06 to 15 were the second most efficient team at drafting and developing in the entire league. They got the most players to play 200 games, second most behind Pittsburgh.
We could
that might surprise you.
That.
Right. The advantage with Martin as well is that, he has experience on the business side outside of hockey, and he's highly educated. So he has a civil engineering degree and an MBA and a finance MBA as well. Really highly intelligent person. And the industry, everybody respects him from that standpoint. So he's been in the position in Anaheim a long time, and he is a really strong leader. And then you look to Ross Mahoney in Washington. They've won a cup, and they've have. So if you look at the top 5 teams that drafted and developing in the salary cap era, 06 to 15, Washington is right below Ottawa, right? Right below Ottawa and right below, Anaheim in that respect. So they're excellent at drafting and developing. Ross Mahoney is well respected. He's educated as well. He was a teacher, University of Saskatchewan, has experience in business outside of hockey. Like, he checks the box. They've won, checks the box. And then you look at the duo in, out of LA with Mike Futa and Mark Yannetti. They came in, and LA wasn't a good franchise. and they built it up from the ground up, won 2 Stanley Cups, tore it down, and then rebuilt it again. And think about that time frame of where, like, the time that LA won their Stanley Cup, and then they started to rebuild, they're right back up into playoff contention. Why isn't the Ottawa Senators? It's been the same timeline.
Oh yeah, for
But if
sure.
you look at the LA Kings, they're in the top 5 best drafting development teams in the salary cap era as well. And you look at the drafting record and development of the LA Kings, and you look at, we'll use Mark Yannetti as an example. So he's run the amateur and pro of scouting in LA. He's run the American Hockey League team there. He's been involved in player development, and he is directly involved with all the analytics department and help builds out all their models as well. And he has a university and he has an Ivy League university degree, like Brown University, Williams College. So obviously extremely highly intelligent. So he checks all the boxes from that standpoint. And then you look at Mike Fuda, and in very similar respects, he did a lot of the same roles, obviously with LA before he left as well. So I think those 4 names would be prime candidates. And then, I think you want to throw Matthew Darche into that because, obviously he interviewed very well with Montreal. Does the GM need to speak French in that marketplace? I think it's a bonus. I don't think it's necessary, but I think it's a bonus. You look at previous GMs, not all of them, spoke French, but I think you can get away with it if you don't. So Martin Madden, obviously, he's Francophone. He lives in Quebec City. His dad was a former scout. So, he checks that box, but I don't think it's not mandatory. I'd rather have highly competent general manager that doesn't speak French over somebody who maybe is not as qualified and does speak French. I mean, it's nice to have, but I think you can live without it. Because I think the fans, at the end of the day, they want to win.
Yeah, it's not quite the same dynamic as in Montreal where they're all about the language, but I guess, Louis, you are a Francophone. Does it matter to you if the GM speaks French?
I do think it serves as more of a tiebreaker, personally. I mean, obviously it helps that, most of the communication that I do is in English and all that, so it's easy to track everything, right? But, exactly, if the bottom line is the fans do want to win first and foremost, right? What we want to see is the team win the Stanley Cup at the end of the day. So if you have 2 completely similar GMs, then sure, take the one that is able to speak bilingually, on his part during media and for the team. But yes, I do think competency is absolutely and should be the number 1 priority in the search.
Particularly for organizations that have won. And that's
what
me,
I was going to say. Yeah.
What's important to me is and if you've been there from the beginning and help build that team into a winner. So if you look at Martin Madden, they didn't win in Anaheim, but they had his record of drafting and developing is ridiculous. The Anaheim Ducks currently have 11 defensemen in the NHL that the Anaheim Ducks have drafted and developed. 11.
I remember all those guys on their 2017 team that was in the conference finals. They had a stacked defense back then, and then now they're all spread out throughout the league at this point, and they still have more.
They're all gone,
but
they have 11 defensemen they've drafted and developed in the NHL. That's insane. That number is ridiculous.
Yeah. And it's going to grow everywhere. Their pool is crazy.
Right. And I give Martin a lot of credit for that. He has an excellent scouting staff, and that makes a difference as an assistant general manager. But then you look at, the Washington Capitals don't get enough credit for their drafting developing. They don't win the Stanley Cup without drafting. And then there's another organization that doesn't get any credit for the goaltenders they draft. I think it was 3 years ago, I had tracked that 6 of the goaltenders in the NHL were drafted and developed by the Washington Capitals. 6, either starters or backups. That's crazy, right? So there's
only so many goalies that you can have in your organization at once.
And 6 of them came out were Washington Capitals. So there's all these little themes that develop in pockets of how exceptional some of these teams are. If you look at the LA Kings under Mike Fuda and Mark Yannetti, the number of players that just get churned out of that organization, and they move them. So if you look at the LA Kings now as an example, one interesting thing is somebody. I heard it was brought up oh, maybe their scouting's not as good. I'm Well, how many of those prospects or those young players got traded away? Look what happened in the Dubois trade. Those were all drafted players that have turned into
Yeah.
NHL players that they traded away. What about Fiala? Trust me, the LA Kings did not want to trade away Brock Faber, but they had to give something. And the Minnesota Wild are super excited to get Brock Faber.
That's what the Sens don't have right now, is those types of prospects to trade away to improve the team. Because like you were saying earlier about the recent first round draft record, we don't have those guys.
No, there's no Logan Brown, there's no Shane Bowers, there's no like Bernard Docker has not turned out yet. Lassie Thompson has not turned out yet. Like, that's 2 defensemen and 2 forwards. Like, even if Brown and Bowers were third line players, but good, really good third round
that would
players,
be great right now.
That changes everything. What if Docker and Thompson are 4 or 5 defensemen? One's a 4, one's a 5, right? It changes the dynamic of what your organization is, because you don't have to go out and spend assets. Like whether it's cap or whether it's assets to acquire to get other players, or you can package an upgrade, right? It gives you that organizational asset flexibility to make those trades without robbing Peter to pay Paul. And that's what happens, is you're trading off assets for the future, and sooner or later the check comes due and the bottom falls out. I use the example of the Vancouver Canucks. When they made their run to the Stanley Cup final, they were the best team in the league. But if you looked at their draft and development record, they were in the bottom 5 of the league. So you knew once those guys started getting a little bit older, the bottom was going to follow that team, and they were going to be terrible because there was no push from below. And that's what you have. And that's where the Sens are right now. They're not like maybe, Buffalo or New Jersey, because they're missing that grouping between 23 to 25. And that was that 2016 to 19 group, that 4 years. They're missing those 4 players, not including the second round picks that, some of them didn't pan out. Now, there's some draft picks that have made it, and it's making the situation look better than it actually is. But I think that's the issue for this organization, is you got to make up for those assets of those 4 draft years. And that's hard to do. And that's going to come through development. You're going to put more assets and more budget into player development and more assets into your middle management. And then, because when you hire a GM, no GM's going to come in and wave their magic wand and everything's going to be okay. What I'm interested in is who they're going to hire as a GM, and then who are they going to hire as their AGMs? Because they need 2 AGMs. Like, somebody has to come in and be the AGM to run both the pro and amateur staff. And then you're going to need another AGM to run your cap and do all your contracts, and ideally manage a research and development department, not an analytics department, because I think that's become antiquated. I think you need to have a more robust R&D department, like a Fortune 500 company. So you're going to have to hire that person too. So you got 2 AGMs and a GM to be hire, and you need to add at least 1 more body, if not 2, in player development. And then you have to consider even expanding your other departments underneath that in your analytics department. And so it's not just GM. And I know the focus is on GM, but it's the lieutenants and colonels underneath that general that is going to make the difference whether this organization really flourishes in the future, because you're going to have to make up for the asset loss from 2016 to 19, and which is why I suggested these 4 gentlemen as potential GM candidates, because what is their bread and butter? It's acquiring, drafting, finding assets from not only other organizations, but drafting, developing players, and finding players that can play in the NHL more than 200 games, because that you have to get to that point. So why not hire people who have that track record? You can look for the really bright young executive coming up, but I'm looking for somebody who's still young, relatively 40, 50 is still young as an executive, but somebody who has a track record in doing that, because I don't think they can afford to hire somebody who doesn't have that track record. I just think it's too much of a risk from an organizational standpoint.
That's why I like the names that you've brought up, because it's a bunch of guys who have longevity with either going between different teams or even within one team and kind of going through the long grind of eventually winning. Like the guys on the Kings, they were there way before they won, right?
Yeah, so was
And
Ross
same with
Mahoney.
Washington.
Yep, same thing, right? And the same crew, and understanding how to build scouting departments from the pro side, amateur side, player development, how all these departments work in synchronicity, because they can't work in silos. And the American League has to be tied directly to all the departments, and then your R&D department. Hopefully, if you build one of those with a human performance department inside of that, like that all has to work in conjunction with each other, and that's going to cost budget. But if you don't have those people in place, you're spreading your personnel too thin, and that's where mistakes are made, because they're good people, but you only have so much cognitive capacity as a human being. All of us are we're limited by that. So you need, people around you to do, as good a job as they possibly can, and have as many of those people as you can. And they're in a great position because now the slate's clean. Like when do you ever get a clean slate and your team isn't god awful, right? They're in the middle of the pack, kind of, around a 500 team. When does that ever happen where you can go out and hunt for a new GM and a couple assistant GMs and go cherry pick off the teams that have won Stanley Cups consistently and have built up Stanley Cup contenders over a decade? Go hunt for those guys and go get them, right? Find who's available that you can, because no one likes sideways moves. So you're not going to get those sideways moves. You have to, if you're going to bump somebody up from an AGM to GM, you can do that. And if you're going to go get an AGM, you can't be an AGM because almost sideways moves almost never happen. So you have to be really strategic. That's why I also sort of brought up these names, is where, some of these guys can jump into AGM roles. You could take two of these guys out of this roster of the four guys.
For sure.
Right. And one of them could be a GM, one could be an assistant GM. And all of a sudden you just cherry picked two top end executives. And then they help build out the rest of the roster. And then you're going to have to find an AGM who can, has an economics background, a finance background, and negotiate contracts and understands the cap and can manage an R&D department to be your other AGM. Because, Peter McTavish isn't there anymore. Right. And they've just had a gaping hole ever since he left. So that hasn't helped either.
I think to sort of wrap up this conversation, I'm going to go between the three of us and ask you guys to pick one of these names. If you had to pick one of the names we've discussed here today, who would you be most comfortable moving forward with as the GM of the Sens? I think Shane has kind of convinced me that Mike Futa would be an awesome choice. I like that he has had such a long tenure in the NHL already, and he was with the Kings before they were good, got the 2 cups, and like Shane pointed out earlier, they were able to rebound very quickly after they started falling off and missing the playoffs a little bit, and they look like they're going to be one of the best few teams in the next few years here. So I really like that he's been involved with that for a long time. Who would you pick, Louis?
Maude, I'm gonna need you to stop picking my answers before.
Oh my God. I saw the look on your face.
But no, both those options, both Fuda and Yannetti are excellent. As Shane said, they've had a big role in terms of in running some of the analytics and the R&D side of things, and that's super promising. And again, being able to bring in someone that has seen the entire cycle from rebuild to contender, and being able to come in, situate themselves, and say, okay, this is where we're at. I know what we need to really promote and develop right away, and what we can kind of focus on later, and exactly know what priorities need to be in place to really maximize the value of this franchise, both now and moving on to the future for the on ice product and all. So I'd really be interested to see one of those two coming in, because that would be just excellent, and I couldn't wait. And with the new ownership and all that, I really am pretty confident that we can bring in someone of that stature. And that, just as Sens fans, I am getting so tired of talking about off ice stuff and injuries, and I yearn for other franchises that can just talk about just on ice performance of players, and I cannot wait for us to get to that kind of point and just rejoice with stuff like that.
We need all that drama out of the way.
It's interesting. You have there's a couple strategic, directions they could go in. So hypothetically, you brought in a Peter Chiarelli, but then he could as a GM, could turn around and hire Mike Futa as an AGM who's done it before. but
Right.
then also could turn around and could ask the LA Kings for permission to hire Yannetti as also another AGM. So you could all of a sudden you could bring in 3 hires from 3 people who have been executives who have won Stanley Cup. So obviously Peter Chiarelli won in Boston. So, or it could be a situation where, like, as you guys alluded to, you could bring in Mike Foote as a GM, but then, potentially Mike could ask LA for permission to hire Mark Yannetti as his right-hand man as AGM in Ottawa. So then you're getting 2 for 1 in a bunch of different situations, or even 3, right? In that respect, if like Ross Mahoney comes in, maybe he could bring in, one of these guys as an AGM, right? Maybe it's Foote and Mahoney, or it's Foote, Mahoney, and Yannetti. Like, those things could happen because Foote doesn't work for an NHL team, Mark Yannetti's not an AGM, and Ross Mahoney is an AGM. Or it could be with Martin Madden, right? Because this is like, the advantage is that you got a couple people in there that are not at the AGM level, so it doesn't have to be this, sideways move, which teams don't like to do. And Peter Chiarelli obviously isn't as a GM right now. He's a senior advisor with St. Louis. So I think Ottawa is in a really interesting situation where, instead of just looking at it from one individual as a GM, look at it from strategically, okay, who is that AGM? Who's that GM going to bring with him, and who's available? Like, what talent's available? Instead of like doing the one hire and then the one hire and then the one hire, and things sort of get spread out. Just look at it from, okay, we're building this organization. Who's available? Who are the best people available? How many of them can we get? Like, because A-level players or A-level people love working with other A-level people, and they don't get to do it very often. So if you can go and cherry pick and pull guys out of organizations who have done what, obviously, both of you had talked about, of building it up to a Stanley Cup contender and then it coming apart, and then rebuilding it again. Like, those are the people that, if I was in an ownership position, I'm like, I would be looking at how many of these guys can we get? How many can we get? Can we get 3 of them? Because is there a way for us to navigate this where we can get 3 of them? Right? Can we get one of them as a GM and 2 as assistant GMs? Can we do that? Is that possible? Because that's what I would be looking at, and not looking at it just the one GM comes in with his magic wand and fixes everything, because that just never happens. It just doesn't exist in the real world.
That makes
we're in
perfect sense.
such like a unique spot where we have so many spots open to bring in so many top level guys.
Yeah, you essentially have 3 spots potentially, right? Now,
you don't see that very often.
No, it depends on how that works in terms of who can do what in that respect and how you fit that in. And so you could potentially, of the 5 names that we talked about, including Peter Chiarelli, you might find a way to be able to get 3 guys out of that 5. It's possible if you want to spend the money, but I think it's worth it.
Absolutely.
I think it'd be like absolutely, like, I have no problem as a business person hiring A-level talent. Like, you pay for that because the return on investment is far more than whatever you're going to pay in their salary.
I think it's very likely too that we go down that sort of a route, because they were saying on TSN that it's less likely that Steve Staios would just himself become the GM, because they were talking about how Ann Lauer is coming from the Canadians, where they have Kent Hughes as the GM, and then it's I can't remember the name, but
Two-headed monster.
Guy. Yeah, the two-headed monster.
Yes.
So maybe we'll see our own two-headed monster, or even three-headed monster, because there's lots of space open in the front office.
Well, that makes it dangerous, because then you have, like, in terms of against the competitors, you have Steve Staios, then you have like a high-level GM, and potentially you're adding 2 more high-level assistant GMs. Like, you could pull 3 people in who have won Stanley Cups from different organizations.
Mm-hmm.
1 is a GM, and 2 is assistant GMs. Like you want to talk about the biggest power move in terms of pulling in like high-level executives. This type of opportunity for an organization rarely happens.
Yeah.
It rarely happens. And if it does happen, it's when the team is absolute garbage and at the bottom of the league, and it's going to be a 7 to 10 year rebuilding. And Ottawa's not there. They're kind of in the middle there. They're like probably 2 or 3 years away from being a real dangerous team if you can mitigate that asset loss from that 2016 to 2019 year. So for me, from an outsider looking at it from a case study, a business case study standpoint, this is going to be interesting in terms of strategic leadership, because that's what position Michael Anlauer and Steve Staios are in. It's like, what do they do with this opportunity? And I wouldn't be worried about like past relationships you have. Let's go get the best people we possibly can, and then you build relationships moving forward.
I agree. It's a huge opportunity to just bring in a ton of successful guys, or guys with tons of success, regardless of how many people it ends up being added to the front office. There's a lot of good options, a lot of opportunity to be had for these executives as well, joining the Senators. Like you said, that they're not a complete bottom feeder right now. That's got to be enticing for people to want the job as well.
It's a Canadian market. Like,
yeah,
people love to work in the Canadian market because the fans care. Like, Sens fans are crazy. They care, and you want to work in an organization where the fans, it matters. And there's going to be a new building soon, and it'll be downtown, and it'll be great. Like, it'll be great to have.
Oh my God.
And that's another opportunity. What do you do with the rink in Canada? Do you blow off like basically that top bowl and drop the roof down, and that's where the American League team plays? So you have the baby Sens.
I never thought about that.
You have the baby Sens in Canada, and then you have the Sens in downtown Ottawa. And then in terms of player development, it changes the whole landscape. Talk to any NHL general managers or assistant GMs that have their farm team right next to their parent club, and they said it changes everything in terms of player development. You look at Calgary, you look at Vancouver, you look at.
I was about to say Vancouver has had it rough with like Utica, right? Like, because that is so far.
That was a terrible situation. Now that's changed. Winnipeg, Toronto, the Kings, San Jose,
all those California teams.
Anaheim and San Diego is just down the road. It's like an hour and a half drive. It's not far. And those type of situations are a huge advantage in terms of player development, because all your people are in the same area, right?
Yeah, there's more exposure. Yeah.
Well, you have your NHL player development, you have your AHL player development, you have your prospect player development. Everybody is close by, right? All your management is together. You can collectively get together. It's like, I use the analogies when you throw a bunch of rocks into the rock tumbler and they're all rough. But if you have a lot of smart people working together all the time, they like that. They like that being close together and having those conversations. And what ends up coming out is a bunch of polished gems. And that's why I think it's really necessary to have your group close together if you can, particularly your farm team. So I would be an advocate of having the baby Sens in Canada and having them close by and not having them far away.
Yeah,
that would make like 4 pro teams, or maybe not pro, but 4 top-notch hockey teams that are with the 67s, the PWHL team, the Sens, and the B-Sens, all like within 30 minutes.
And then Gatineau's just across, right? So the Q's there too. Yeah. Like, honestly, Ottawa would be the best Canadian city to watch hockey. And then you have college hockey not even an hour away.
Yeah.
Right, just down the road. So, I mean, to me, they would be the best hockey city in the country from that standpoint. But I look at it from like the business standpoint. It's going to save you so much time and money in player development if you're right next door to each other. And then it not only saves you money, it's just like the call ups, right? What if there's bad weather? I love the paper transactions that teams do. Right? When you have my team is right there, we'll do just a paper transaction. And then over time of a year, you might save yourself $500,000 by just doing simple paper transaction. And then it comes to deadline, that matters. It's all those kind of strategic things to think about. Oh, it's going to cost us money to be in Canada. Oh, but you have a savvy AGM who could do paper transactions. You're going to skim cap off for sure and save it to what you can. I know you can. Towards the trade deadline. So there's a lot of different options for the Ottawa Senators. I think they're right now, I know there's a lot of chaos for the fans, but I think they're the most intriguing team in the NHL right now for its potential of what's coming next. They could really hit some home runs here in the next couple of years.
You're 100% correct.
Yeah, new building downtown, move the baby Sens into Canada, new executives, add to your hockey ops staff. I think it'd be a huge boost to the franchise.
Even though there's been all this drama and turmoil lately, you are right that I think things will be looking up, especially once the team gets that new management group in place. I think it's going to be nothing but positivity moving forward, even though it's a little bit rocky on the ice right now. Hopefully the Sens will be able to turn things around against Tampa on Saturday night. My co-host Charlie will have that stream for all the watchers out there. And we're going to skip on the chat segment tonight, not because it wasn't busy, shout out to everyone in the chat, but just because my camera battery is about to die because we're going on so long here. I could talk to both of you all night. It's been an amazing discussion. Louis, do you want to plug your show and your social media?
Yeah, you can find me on Twitter and on Blue Sky. Just Louis Boulet, my name, you'll find me there. And the Zubcast also, which is a podcast that me and two of my buddies have, along with some potential hockey analytics and dashboards that I've been posting preliminarily there, and maybe some more coming from that on a more set platform like a website or something soon. So stay tuned for that. And Maude, thank you so much for having me on.
Always a pleasure. And Shane, where can the people find you?
We're Hockey Prospect Radios on Sirius XM NHL Network Radio. So we air on Saturdays and Sundays. It's generally airs 6 or 7 times, but you can find it in the podcast format. So it'll be on any of your podcast platforms like Spotify or Apple. So if you miss it, if you don't have Sirius XM, you can listen to it there. So I'm easily found on Twitter. It's at HP Radio or at Shane Malloy, and you can find out when the next show is up. Actually, this weekend, we're on Saturday morning and Saturday afternoon, and then Sunday morning and Sunday afternoon on Sirius XM. But when in doubt, you can always listen to the podcast. I appreciate it.
Awesome. So lots of content coming from Shane that you guys can check out too. Yeah, so that's going to do it for tonight. Thank you everyone so much for watching. Subscribe to SDPN if you are not already subscribed. Leave a like on the video. And yeah, thank you for watching and listening. Have a good night, everyone.